this alumni webcast. My business partner, Sally, and I hope to show you an approach to this intriguing title of being beyond change initiatives, which is based on the foundations of MPOD and takes us to the edges, we think, of organization development and change. And we hope to hear from you about that at the end of our webcast. In this time together, we are wanting to reframe organizational change in ways that are practical, but also in ways that are that represent a new paradigm. From thinking about organizational change to evolution. And I know that you will recognize that that's not new. It's actually very, very ancient. We also expect that you'll gain an understanding of a flourishing living system approach, which looks at living systems not as metaphor, but as inherent to our organizations as living systems. You'll also gain insights on particular organizational dynamics that happen in living systems everywhere. And when we take these dynamics, instead of resisting them and instead leverage them, they can lead to high performance and well-being. And we hope that along the way, you'll see in our story a way of making meaning, at least for us as practitioners, in our own work, with our clients and our collaborators, and in our profession. So when we start to think about flourishing living systems, we look at biomimicry, which is nature's best ideas that are adapted for human use, but goes beyond that. Flourishing living systems starts with the ideas that organizations are, at least in part, living systems. And that inspiration, nature then does not become a metaphor for us, but rather a mentor to remind us of who we already are. And as you might be able to see from what I'm saying, that there is a legacy in MOD and MPOD in what we're saying in starting from what works with a strengths-based approach, from the holistic approach that we saw in our programs, looking at complex adaptive systems and a very practical approach in our program. And all of those things we've integrated with other ways of looking at organization development and change. So let's look now at the Flourishing Living Systems platform.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you. And I also just want to check with Pat and Kevin, can you still hear and see us? Because our visual is gone. Are you still there? Okay, great. Wonderful, thank you. So without getting into a tremendous amount of detail, the platform itself is really organized around 3 steps, if you will. And the first is beginning to see using nature as inspiration. And we feel that that really is a wonderful way of being able to not only awaken our senses and open our minds and our hearts, but it's also a fabulous way of being able to sort of quiet human cleverness, as Janine Benyus, the mother of biomimicry, has said, and be able to expand our what is to really be able to include what is possible as it's emerging. The second step is really learning from nature as teacher, and this is where we immerse ourselves in nature's strategies. For flourishing living systems, we look particularly at ecosystems because we're understanding how the organisms are operating together and how the ecosystems are operating as part of broader biomes. From that, we really are able to see models for flourishing. We're able to discern what Mother Nature has to teach us, and as we move into apply, we're able to look at how do we translate these strategies and these insights into our human organizations in ways that really make sense. including the fact that we as humans are part of nature. What I also want to underscore is that the work that we're doing in biomimicry in general, but I think in particular, living systems work that is being done as applied to organizations is, as this slide says, frontier space, which means that there's not decades of research and case studies out there, which quite frankly is one of the things that really excites us about this field, because it's an invitation for us to get in and learn together and actually create the knowledge that is going to be so helpful as we're looking at organizations moving forward. And throughout the next 45 minutes, while Argerie and I are sharing what we have to share today, if you can jot down any questions that you have that may be coming up for you, you can share them using chat, but even if you want to share them with us afterwards. We love questions because questions are oftentimes what we learn with and through. So with that.
Well, you've seen these statements before around organizational change. And as you skim them and remind yourself, you'll recognize that they come out of the context of a speedier pace of change, out of the digital revolution, which is changing everything.
Argerie, can I interrupt you for a second? You guys, your slides are no longer being shared.
Okay.
Oh, thanks for letting us know.
Not a problem.
So the statements that we're showing you are statements which we think no longer serve. And we're looking to create a new language and a new approach for organizational change on the basis of evolution. Now, by coincidence, just today, at this very hour, the Association for Change Management is also featuring a webinar. And the learning objectives for that webinar are thus: to understand the 3 conversations that drive organizational change. And I think it's interesting that there are 3 conversations. To identify the coaching gap in your change leadership toolkit. And I think that it's interesting that there's a gap and that there's a toolkit that a coach can offer a protege so that they will change. So you get my drift. I think that there's a lot to learn from our toolkits, and we also have a toolkit. We want to suggest that there's more to amplify the ways that we approach change. So now, Kevin, are you seeing our screen?
No.
So I want to pause for just a moment and see if we can get the slides back up. Apologize for this, but let me just see if we can get our screen shared once again. And as we're working through wonderful technology.
I think we have to find Zoom.
Okay. All right. Zoom is right here.
Let's go back to meeting.
Okay. Doesn't give us the share.
Do you have some guidance, Kevin?
So at the top, it should say Zoom meeting ID. And then at the bottom, it should say, it's a big green button, share screen.
There it is. Got it. Thank you.
So you can see that what we're talking about is re-perceiving change. And it starts by re-perceiving our organizations and our role in organizations. So there are 3 ways that we will be inviting re-perceiving of change.
Allowing us to do it for some reason.
When Kevin, when we're in screen share, apparently it's not letting us advance the slides, so we can have one or the other. That's very strange, and we don't know why.
I mean, I see the screen. I see the shared screen now. If you
Yeah.
guys minimize this and go to the PowerPoint.
Go to the PowerPoint here. Yeah. Okay, and then let's just try advancing that. Yeah, that's the problem. We can't advance it.
Hold on. We were doing it before. Here we go.
Nice. So we have three, the Flourishing Living Systems invites us to think differently about three things. Number one, that organizations are living systems. Number two, that we and our organizations are a part of a web of life. And as such, then the capacity for us to connect is at the heart of flourishing. And number three, that as living systems, organizations evolve. We're going to talk about each of these three things in turn. Yeah, and we're not able to advance, so we can't talk about each of these three things in turn. We can talk about them, but we can't show you. What do you suggest?
Wait, I got it.
Okay, great.
All right, so we're experiencing a flourishing living system right now, along with all of you. So we appreciate your being in the flow with us as we're trying to figure out how to make the structural aspects of this work. So the first invitation, as Argerie said, is really looking at our organizations differently and recognizing that much of the way that we see organizations now and tend to work with them and perceive of them has more of a mechanistic leaning to it. And that came out of the Industrial Revolution. It's something that we've learned to do very well. We really value things like stability and predictability and control. And this is really where the roots of managed change came. And mechanistic aspects of our organization are absolutely essential. What we're saying is that they're not sufficient as we're looking at the organizations dealing with the world that we live in today. And when we think about a mechanistic approach, we tend to kind of break the organizational system down into parts, thinking we can understand the system by understanding the parts, which means that we're more focused on objects. Relationships are there, but the object is really primary. And then we tend to measure and quantify those objects. And the last point is that we tend to pay more attention to the structural aspects with a sense that structure gives rise to and shapes process. If we add to that approach a way of being able to work with our organizations as organic systems, then we're better able to really look at how we attend to our need to adapt, how we deal with the need for flow in our organizations of information and ideas and innovation, novelty, how we support the emergence of new. And in an organic approach, what we tend to focus on is the whole, and recognizing that we can understand the parts when we're really looking at the whole. We tend to focus more on relationship than object because it's the relationships that essentially are defining how the whole is working together. And rather than measuring, we tend to map because relationships really can't be measured. And we tend to pay attention to qualities and recognize that processes have the power to essentially shape and oftentimes give rise to structures. When we're working with a flourishing living systems, we're holding both. We're holding both this mechanistic and this organic approach, which really represents what we refer to as a generative tension, also known as a polarity, which is really recognizing the both and of flourishing living systems, that we need to be able to hold and attend to both of these. The second invitation really has to do with perceiving ourselves in our organizations as part of a broader web of life. Our organizations are networks, and we're part of broader networks. And when we're doing that, it's supporting us in sort of shifting how we're perceiving of change. We're really starting to look at that in the context of evolution. There is a saying in nature that nature doesn't change, it creates new in the midst of what is, which I think oftentimes helps reduce the stress and the anxiety around change initiatives, because it takes the focus off of having to change and really looks at what new is needing to come in to support the kind of evolution that's needed. And then last but not least, that evolution really does ensure survival. It's been doing that for 3.85 billion years on planet Earth. change may or may not.
The third invitation is to reperceive change itself. And we're familiar with the Lewin model that has us freeze the current state, then unfreeze it, and then refreeze to some new future state. But the thing is, when there's a big forest fire and the hillside is decimated, nature doesn't look to perform a gap analysis to figure out what steps need to be taken to renew that hillside. Rather, in that and all natural ecosystems, there are inherent dynamics in play that are often at different polarities with each other. And in organizational ecosystems, they might be dynamics of continuity and novelty, or the dynamics between looking at departments and the whole system, or the dynamics of structure and flow. The thing is that every organization as a natural system has their unique mix and balance of these polarities together, creating a pattern which can be leveraged for performance and well-being. So we see this continual play. The object is for all people in an organizational ecosystem to understand how, first to see what that unique pattern is, and then to be working within those generative tensions. Now this takes us to a contrast between the current story of change and the new, which is really the ancient story of evolution. These three invitations show us a contrast with the current story, which seeks to manage change to control and predict, which designs workflows and processes, and which wants to maximize key functions. And the new story of evolution evolves to survive and thrive, self-organizes, and optimizes the whole. The point here is that we're not saying that one needs to go away and the other needs to take over. This itself is a polarity, and we're talking about change in the context of evolution.
So you've just had an opportunity to experience a little bit of the first step that we talked about, or stage of seeing as part of the Flourishing Living Systems platform. We're going to talk just a little bit about what it is we can learn from nature and natural systems. There's a lot of depth we can go into here. We're going to pick on a few areas. First of all, it's really important when we're thinking about natural systems and we're thinking about our organizations as living systems, natural systems, is to recognize that everything in nature, whether it's an organism or ecosystems, are designing within a context. And from the natural world's perspective, that context is something that we refer to as Earth's operating conditions. There's 4 of them: limits and boundaries, sunlight, water, and gravity, cyclic processes, and dynamic non-equilibrium. We're not going to delve into any of them in great depth, but I want to underscore the importance of 2. One is dynamic non-equilibrium. Argerie was just talking about the change models, or the way that we as humans have tended to approach change, where we want to get to a point where we can freeze. There's some state of equilibrium, then we have to change, and we try to get through it as fast as we can, and then we get to the new state of equilibrium. Well, on planet Earth, there is no state of equilibrium. We are constantly, and that includes us in our organizations, living in a dynamic state, which means that everything is always changing. But the kicker is it's not changing to a new state of equilibrium. The states are always changing as we're moving. So when we're looking at how we're approaching our organizations, it kind of turns certain things on their heads. The other has to do with cyclic processes. I think this is one of my favorite areas when we're working with organizations, because part of it is recognizing what are all the cyclic processes that that we as organizations, as teams, as leaders are subject to. On planet Earth, we deal with things like seasons, we deal with day and night, we deal with tides. I could go on and on. This that is on the screen right now is something that was developed by a couple of phenomenal ecologists, Lance Gunderson and C.S. Holling, to really be able to capture the flow, the natural flow in ecosystems. And from really, if you look at the lower left corner, which is essentially in a new ecosystem, the exploitation phase, which is when the R species get in and take over as fast as they can, as much as they can. And you can see this in startups, you can see this in skunk works, you can see this in new areas of organizations, new industries. Then ultimately, it's going to move into the upper right-hand corner, which is really about conservation. This is when we spend time building infrastructure and trying to get processes and all the things internally that we need in place. The challenge there is that the more that we put in of that, the more brittle and fragile and sort of unyielding the organization becomes, or the system becomes. And if we're not aware of the natural process of release, which is also referred to as creative destruction, it can catch us unaware. When we are aware of it, we're able to kind of utilize that release phase and then move into a natural stage of reorganization. Attending to that in our organizations really helps us have a different understanding of the energy flows and the dynamics that are at play. So the other thing that we can learn from nature, and this is at the core of flourishing living systems, is what we refer to as 3 properties that are essential or are essential within healthy, productive ecosystems, which includes organizations as ecosystems. And oftentimes when we are moving, we're trying to move through a change, in many ways, we're using a different iteration of an old vision. What these 3 properties allow us to do is kind of look at the best and the brightest of systems that exist on this planet and learn what properties are consistent in those systems. They're referred to as emergent properties, which means that they exist at the level of the system and they exist when conditions are present for them to exist. The first is resilience, and this is something that we hear a tremendous about today in much of our conversation. But we found that oftentimes there isn't really an in-depth understanding of what resilience really means. And resilience is essentially the measure of a system's ability to persist in a variable environment. Another way of putting it is its ability to kind of sustain in a constancy of disruption and stress, which pretty much is what we deal with today in most of our organizations. When we think about resilience, there's 2 aspects of resilience that are really important to pay attention to. One is the length of time it takes us to recover. So whether it's us as an individual system recovering from an illness, or it is an organization recovering from some kind of disruption or an industry, it's the length of time it takes us to recover. The other is the magnitude of stress and disruption that we're actually able to recover from. And I think we probably hear more and pay more attention to the first than we do the second. But oftentimes, a system will reach a certain level where it can't actually recover. It can't come back to a stable state, or at least some degree of a stable state. When we look at very resilient systems, they not only recover quickly, but they come back to a stable state, but oftentimes it's an even stronger state.
So Sally, say something about why we've chosen to put mangrove here.
Oh, thank you. So mangroves, for those of you that love the tropics like I do, mangroves are amazing. They are, I think, one of the most resilient species on the planet. They have to deal with constant flux of salt water and fresh water. Twice a day, the tides are coming in and going out, and they are dealing with being immersed entirely in salt water air, and fresh water. And rather than complaining about the fact that these aren't conditions that are ideal for them, they've developed strategies for being able to take in what they need from the air and the fresh water and essentially be able to get rid of, through transpiration, the salt water. What supports resilience? Resilience is, I think, one of the big things to pay attention to when we're looking at resilience is feedback loops. And when we're talking about feedback loops, we're talking about feedback loops that are happening throughout the system, all kinds of mechanisms, all kinds of scales, both temporal and spatial, with redundancy. So it's not a matter of leaning out everything. And in fact, some of the leaning process can actually undermine our ability to be resilient. Renewal. In nature, every organism and ecosystem has built in a way of continuously adding energy and material to the system that restores and heals the system. What does that look like in our organizations? And recognizing that we need to be working with cyclic processes. So as we mentioned before, the more aware we are of the cycles that we're subject to within our organizations and our industry, the better able we are to be resilient. If we look at what impedes resilience, well, first of all, it's hard to see until it's too late and until we reach that point where we're in distress. Consequently, it's easy to sacrifice it in the face of other more, short-term goals like productivity, things like that. And in organizations, oftentimes we have lots and lots of layers in systems. Well, when there's too many layers in a system, it actually impedes resilience because it creates not only delays to essential feedback, but it distorts the signals, which can be disastrous at times. If you've ever played telephone tag, many of you on this call may be too young to remember that. I'm not. But basically, you shared something with the person next to you, and by the time it came back, it didn't even resemble what you had originally shared. And as we look at, enabling resilience in our organizations, these are just some of the questions that we can begin to ask ourselves. Are we enabling feedback throughout our system, throughout our team? Are we taking into account the cycles that are at play and having an impact on us? Are we addressing all the different layers of scale, levels of scale that are at play? Are we enabling opportunities and resources for renewal? The second is self-organization, and self-organization is something that probably about 20 years ago was very prevalent and then just sort of went away. And I think we probably know the reasons for that. But self-organization is just the ability of a system to make its structure more complex. It appears everywhere in nature. The ants that you can see on the screen are actually self-organizing to create a bridge across the water that's part of their habitat so that they can transport food. They don't have a bridge team. They don't argue about who is going to play what role. They organize to be able to accomplish what is needed to be accomplished. And one of the beautiful things about self-organization is that it naturally creates heterogeneity. And the unpredictability part may not be as desirable in some organizations, but in many cases, it's the unpredictability that brings in the novel, which allow organizations to innovate. And self-organization is naturally doing this. When we allow elements of our organizations to self-organize, they're likely to come up with new structures, new designs, new way of doing things, which is really great because we're tapping the natural energies that are there. And as I said, it's a property of living systems. So what supports self-organization? Well, I think to begin with, it's essential that there is a certain level of freedom, an ability for experimentation, and an appetite for a certain amount of disorder. If we go back and think about the mechanistic aspects that we're so good at in our organizations, and which are important, but not sufficient, that kind of bumps up against that desire for stability and predictability and control. So we really need to kind of create space and sort of learn to be able to self-organize. And simple rules. Simple rules are at the heart of self-organization. If you're one like me that loves to watch starlings flock, it's amazing. They're moving at like 40 miles an hour. They are not running into each other. You're not seeing little starlings falling out of the sky due to collisions. And they're able to do this in these beautiful formations because they're following simple rules. And what impedes self-organizations? Well, I think that the biggest problem is that it scares people. It threatens power structures. I think this is probably the biggest reason that we have not been able to, in many of our organizations, leverage the power of this, which I think the nascent power of self-organization is probably one of the greatest powers that we have. We're blind to that, so consequently it's easy to sacrifice it in the face of other things that feel more important. And once again, you can see these fire ants, or well, actually these are bees, sorry, organizing to be able to accomplish what they need to from a hive perspective. So if we look at what supports us in enhancing our self-organization, it's what degree of freedom and support is there? Are we even looking at the power of simple rules? Are we able to support connections that exist while we're creating opportunities for new connections to emerge? And how well are we actually enabling learning within and across the different aspects of the system? And the last property, I love it when we're working with people in person, because we can usually see a bodily response when people see the word hierarchy, because it's sort of like the ugly stepchild. And in reality, hierarchy in nature is the only reason that, for instance, that tree is able to stand. Hierarchy is nothing more than the organization of systems and subsystems. And if it weren't for hierarchy, which is basically moving from, it's what allows us to move from simple to complex forms, because it enables the formation and stability of intermediate forms as we're growing, as we're morphing, whatever it might be.
So of course there's a disconnect, apparent disconnect, because we think about hierarchy in organizations as a bad thing. And one of our colleagues said recently that made us laugh. She said, hierarchy isn't bad. She said, bad hierarchy is bad.
Yeah, so, and if we look at the hierarchies, I mean, typically we connect that with top down, and I'm not even sure from a natural perspective that would meet the definition of hierarchy, because the purpose of hierarchy is always to promote and help the subsystems do their jobs better. And I think about many of the hierarchies, I think that's changing in many, many ways. But if I look back 5-10 years, many of the top-down hierarchies were certainly not in place to help these subsystems do their jobs better. Hierarchies actually are promoting the welfare of the overall system. And we talked earlier on about these generative tensions or polarities. Hierarchies oftentimes enable some of these essential ones. They allow us to have both freedom to act and responsibility. You'd be thinking about that in terms of enabling coordination and allowing for autonomy. They afford stability and adaptability. And if you look at the images on this particular slide, particularly the bronchial system, the leaf branching system. Branching is a very, very common hierarchical form in nature. And the reason it is one of the most efficient designs for being able to move resources, oftentimes liquid, but nutrients, information, over large spaces in a very quick and efficient manner. And if we look at why hierarchies go bad, it's when some aspect of the system is starting to dominate at the expense of another aspect of the system. And I think this is something that we tend to see more in our organizations than we actually experience the beauty of natural hierarchies. And just to highlight the image of this sunflower, that design at the center isn't just beautiful. It is actually also the most efficient packing of information possible in that amount of space that nature has accomplished. So if we look at nature or hierarchy in organizations, we see it everywhere. I come from the architectural world prior to getting into the world of organization development and design. And architecture is a form of hierarchy, some working very well to support organizations, some not as well. When we look at organization design and reporting structures, all of those are examples of hierarchy in our organizations. So what supports hierarchy and how is it supporting us? Is it, is it allowing us freedom for experimentation? Is there some tolerance for disorder? Is it allowing us to leverage the polarities that are needed to be worked across the system? It is supporting autonomy as well as the willingness, the ability to coordinate and work with others in the system. Yeah.
So you've just seen these three ways of looking at emergent properties, which are conditions for flourishing. And to contrast then with the current mode of change management in many sectors, I just want to acknowledge that the ways that we've talked about and learned and advanced ideas of change in MPOD and certainly in MOD have begun to bridge that difference. We see in David Cooperrider and Lindsay Goodwin's the new change equation, for example, harbingers of the ways that nature evolves. And so what we may have been painting as a picture of black and white, we completely acknowledge is actually part of what we're talking about. It's in evolution, there are emergent qualities which may or may not have been predictable. Who would have seen the new change equation when we were doing appreciative inquiry summits 20 years ago? And so now we're hoping that what we're doing is continuing to evolve the way that we work in organizations. So now we want to hear from you if you've had questions along the way. And we also want to invite you to learn more with us on Flourishing Living Systems. In August, we're offering a Flourishing Living Systems Fundamentals Workshop, a 2.5-day program at the Holden Arboretum near Cleveland, Ohio, where we'll be asking more of these questions and diving deep in the context of real initiatives, organizational initiatives for change and for design. And be in touch with us. After this fundamentals workshop, we will be inviting and convening practice communities where we could come together as practicing professionals to think together about the real applications of flourishing living systems in our own work. So we leave you with the idea that contrasts what we hear about so often as change agents, as change managers even, to be thinking about the evolution and the flowering of that way, framing of change to nature as change. What does that really mean for us? And we hope that we've begun to at least ask provocative questions, if not have all the answers for them. But the thing that really gets me the most is to remember that when Sally and I work around flourishing living systems, we don't start with or expect that we will have expected or controlled outcomes. What we're interested in is how we're co-creating conditions for flourishing. Yeah. And we hope that we've at least begun to suggest that kind of way of thinking. We're going to stop sharing for a minute so that we can see you and you can see us. And then we have an announcement from MPOD that we'd like to make.
So we're going to stop and come back.
We'll stop and come back. So Kevin, are there questions that you want to offer?
There are no questions currently in the chat box.
Okay.
I just wrote for people to contribute them if they have them.
And Pat, shall we just go on to your advertisement here?
Well, it's up to you. If you'd like, is there anybody that has any questions for Argerie or Sally? You can just unmute your phone and ask. Or as we've stated before, you could type them into your chat box.
Hi, Sally and Argerie. This is Heather. Hi, I'm sorry. I tried typing it, but it was a little bit slow. Thank you. Thank you very much for hosting this. I actually started kind of tearing up a couple times. I just feel it's extremely powerful stuff that you guys have here. And I'm so excited that you guys are here. And I have two kind of questions really quickly. How have you seen a lot of these very rigid 18th century industrial era organizations start to adapt to this more fluid, there's more fluid structures and ways of thinking? And then has there been a lot of like academic level research that's going into kind of these, you described the 4 types of emergent patterns or systems that happen in nature. So has there been academic research in kind of capturing these things that present themselves in nature and how we can work them into our human-based systems, if that is, and if those make sense. So
Thanks, that's great.
Yeah, Heather, I'm going to start with your second question, and you can let me know if I actually got the question right. I think you may be referring to the 4 cycles.
yes.
Yeah, I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have hands to talk to. That work, so there is a phenomenal book called Panel that was written by Gunderson and Holland, and I would recommend it. It's wonderful. That whole model has been applied to natural systems, natural resources management. So in the whole world of sustainability, I've had an opportunity to talk with and spend a day with C.S. Holling, which was an absolute delight, as well as Lance Gunderson, that's right. And, but I don't think that what hasn't happened is the application to organizations or businesses and business ecosystems. So I think a lot of that is the newer end of the work. We're teaming with some folks at University of Southern California right now that their focus is organization design, and one of our colleagues and I and us are working in that particular area of really beginning but continuing the translation into organizations. So from an academic standpoint, if that's something that you're interested in, we'd love to talk with you about that. That would be fabulous. And then your first question about the, I can't remember what you referred to them as, but
How do a more 18th century more rigid organization?
I was feeling tired as you were saying that. I'll give an example. One of the things that we've learned through this work is that we really love doing tasters. And in a sense, this was a little bit of a taster. Our preferred is when we're able to do that where there's interaction, because it's one thing to hear about this. It's a whole different experience to start to try things on and get out in the natural world and really start to look at things, including your organization, a little bit differently. So the idea of bringing tasters in also allows us to get a sense with organization as to where, when we're looking at the Living Systems platform, and we're sharing in a taster, we're paying attention to where are the points of resonance for an organization, even if they tend to be a more traditional. what is lighting them up, and you can kind of see it, and they're already having ahas. And then we begin to kind of organize work that we do with them around that. And I'll give a quick example. A few years ago, we were working with a very traditional Northeast Ohio manufacturing company, working with them to first support a team in kicking off that was a cross-disciplinary, cross-functional team that was taking on the redesign of materials management flow. Now, we're not materials management experts. So we worked with the team, and then we came back and supported them in actually designing the new flow process. And what we did, without talking to them about living systems, it may have been there in the background, we brought in the idea of simple rules as a way of really, became the organizing principle for the redesign of that system. So I will stop there.
Heather, do we answer your question?
Yes, you did wonderfully. Thank you. I would definitely enjoy reaching out to you guys after this. So thank you.
Thank you for being here.
We
What
have
other
a
questions?
quick clarifying question. What was the name of the book by Holding and Gunderson?
Panarchy, Panarchy.
Great. And then we have a question from Keith. He asks, how have you thought about partnering with OD leads within organizations on this new model / way of thinking, shifting from more traditional change models, building internal capacity, etc.?
It's interesting that thanks, Keith. Hi.
Hi.
It's interesting that, but not surprising, that it's organization development leaders who are resonating with flourishing living systems. And what they are resonating with is the holistic aspect of it. We're working with a leader now who has said, this feels like the thing that we've been waiting for because of the holistic approach. So we're at the beginning stages of bringing this into organizations and talking with leaders such as in organization development and human resources, but also more innovative thinking leaders in the business areas. And what they tend to want is something very specific. You're not going to be surprised by this. Something very specific. One of two things. The very specific thing is they want help in refreshing a strategy. And so, as Sally's story showed before, it's showing the process without talking about the process necessarily while producing an effective outcome. But the other way is just inviting us in to have the conversation. And I have been shocked how much that actually resonates with just the conversation without having the project. If you would have asked me, I would have said, don't do it that way. But it's having the conversation that sparks people's imagination. And out of that, sometimes there's a project that is applicable.
Mm-hmm. And this may not be directly answering your question, but we are partnering and teaming up with organization design forums. So the organization design aspect, we are going to be presenting at Change.
Oh, it's Change Management Institute.
Yeah, CMI. So we presented at the Organization Design Forum and up in Ann Arbor this spring, early spring, and a number of the participants have reached out. It was supported. It was sponsored in part by Change Management, ACMP, and so they've been reaching out as well. So I think that there is this really interesting partnering that's taking on professionally, and as Argerie mentioned, what we're finding is that there's just this sense that this just makes sense, and I think it's part of it. It's because we are living systems, and we recognize this. It's that having, so there's something that is just true about this work.
Sometimes people even tear up.
Yes, we do.
Are there other questions? Just unmute. Well, we'd like to give Pat a chance to let you know what else is happening in the MPOD mod world. And Pat, if you're ready to unmute and talk about all those good things coming up, we'll share the slide. Are you there? Unmute, Pat.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I think we had two people that needed to unmute me, not so anyway. Someone asked if you've published this work anywhere.
Oh, right. What have we published? So we have a blog, and you know, people who advise bloggers say those become eventually the chapters of the book. So no, not yet, unless we count blogging. And really, those are serious posts that talk about the principles of flourishing living systems, but also we're beginning to include some practical insights.
To add to that, we have a number of white papers in process that need to be finalized. And I would say that a book is in the works. I think realizing that there's an importance to, like you said, publishing and kind of getting this out there.
Let's just talk about the book. Yeah. So the book that's the first one on the list, we're calling Glimmers of, the working title, it's Glimmers of Flourishing. And we're taking a book out of, a page out of the book of Aim to Flourish. You know, that lovely institution that is looking to understand the profiles of organizations that thrive. For us, we're looking for leaders for whom flourishing living systems is already natural, and in some ways there are glimmers of that flourishing in their worlds. So we have 3 leaders already that we're beginning conversations with in the early stages. And we invite you, if there's leaders that you would like to join that conversation, we would love to meet them.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pat. We keep trying to advertise.
That's okay. We've had several people ask if you would be willing to share your slide deck. We did record your session, and I'll be making that available to all of the people that registered, and we'd love to have your slides as well. So if you could send them to me.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for asking.
Yet the recording includes all the technical difficulties.
We'll edit
Yes,
that.
it does. Unfortunately, we can't edit them out. So that will be helpful to have this actual slide deck, okay? Thank you so much, ladies. Sally, Argerie, it was a pleasure having you join us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for sharing this slide. I just wanted to, on behalf of the Alumni Association and the MPOD program, just share with all of you some upcoming events that you may want to participate in. And these are just a few of them, not to mention our webcast that we'll be hosting next month, where on July 24th, we will have David Cooperrider presenting. So if you could keep these dates in mind, we'll look forward to seeing you. Again, thank you, Argerie and Sally. This was a great session. I appreciate it.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
All right, goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.